On this podcast, you'll learn some colloquial expressions that will help you to refer to what you're talking about. Expressions like to talk across purposes, and what it boils down to, and to make head or tail of something. And these expressions will help you speak English in a more natural way. So welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And together with nearly 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, mate?
I'm doing really well. I'm feeling good and I'm looking forward to another recording. So, how are you? What have you been up to?
I've been very busy. I've been playing around here with cameras and microphones, and I set up a green screen to record some video work that I'm doing for a course that's coming out soon. So I've been very busy, but I'm enjoying every second of it. And it's great to be podcasting again this week with you. What's first this week?
Well, first we got a voice message and it's from Ricardo from Alicante.
Hello, teachers. This is Ricardo from Alicante again, one of your regular listeners. Well, in this second short recording, I would like to sound a bit better than the previous one in all the aspects of this skill. I mean, pronunciation, intonation, rhythm, and so on. And with the plot of today's subject, I mean legends, I would say that the Spanish version of this character of Robin Hood could be any of our bandits as Diego Corriente, also known as the Generous Bandit, although never has been accredited that he was generous indeed. I think that is enough for now. By the way, great job as always. Ta-ta for now, friends.
Okay, Ricardo, thanks very much. And we have to say that yes, you do sound better than in your last voice message, so you're definitely improving. Well done.
Yes, thank you for your message. One or two things, though, that I think we can help you with to make you sound even better next time. You started your message with the expression in the plot of today's subject. That's a little bit confusing. I think it's better to say something like, as far as today's subject is concerned, or moving on to today's subject. Or you could use the expression referring to. So referring to the podcast about legends. Or I'd just like to mention, or I'd just like to touch on the podcast about legends. And that podcast episode that Ricardo referred to was episode 380, in which we spoke about 6 great British legends. So if you haven't heard that podcast, go to inglespodcast.com/380.
And you gave an example of a Spanish bandit who was a legend. We could correct the way you introduced him. You said a Spanish bandit as Diego Corrientes Mateos. But it's not as, it's such as. That's a typical mistake because you think in Spanish, como, but it's not as. It's such as equals, for example. Or you could say just the word like, but you can't say the word as on its own. You have to say such as, or for example, or like.
Now, I don't know if you'd heard of this guy, Reza. I had not heard of him, Diego Corrientes Mateos. Did you know who he was?
I've never heard of him.
So thank you for letting us know about him, Ricardo. I did look up one or two things about him on the internet. He lived between 1757 and 1781, and he was a famous Spanish bandit who also, like Robin Hood, as you said, gave money very generously to the poor. Can you tell people anything more about him, Reza?
Well, the information we found out is that in 1780, Charles III, the King of Spain, at that time, he offered 100 gold pieces to anyone who captured Corrientes Mateos, dead or alive. That was a very common thing they said in those days. Reward, money you get for capturing someone, dead or alive. So it didn't matter if you brought them in as a person or as a corpse, a body.
And he fled to Portugal. And the verb to flee, the past is fled, F-L-E-D, which means to run away quickly. So he ran away quickly. He fled to Portugal, but he was captured by the governor of Seville. And a band of Portuguese, or a group of Portuguese, under Captain Arias. What happened after he was taken back to Seville, Reza?
So after being brought back to Seville, he was tried. Now, to try someone means you make them go through a legal proceeding, a trial. So he was tried and they found him guilty and he was sentenced to death by hanging. So to hang, to put a rope around someone's neck.
And many outlaws in the UK were killed like that, weren't they? They said they were hung, drawn and quartered, which means their body was cut up into different parts. And the same thing happened to Corrientes Mateos, to Diego. His body was cut into pieces and sent to different provinces where he had been active. So every part of his body was distributed around the country, depending on where he was most active as a bandit. Now, his head remained in Seville and it was buried in the church of San Roque, where it was found in the 20th century when they were doing restoration work on the church. Imagine finding a head in a hole somewhere because you're digging a hole. And how did they know it was his head? They must have done a DNA or some kind of test on it to realize it was the head of this bandit.
So he had a pretty grisly end. Grisly means with blood and death and horrible things. He had a very grisly end, did old Diego.
So thank you, Ricardo, for telling us about that and letting us know about the Spanish equivalent of Robin Hood. Next, we have a voice message from Juan from Argentina, who we need to say congratulations to because Juan recently passed his English exam.
Hello, Reza. Hello, Craig. I'm Juan from Argentina. I'm in the army. I sent you a message last year. I would like to tell you that I passed level 5 examination and I got 8.6. I'm studying for level 6, that is about B2, and I have the final examination in November. I usually go running and I put on my headphones and I enjoy listening to your podcast. The last podcast have been very useful for me because I have to learn colloquial expressions and I need to learn more about expressions or idioms like, I don't know, like to say the least, make small talk, get a real talking to, get to the point, make head or tail, talk shop, talking at cross purposes. If you prepare a podcast about these expressions, it would be very helpful for me. And thank you very much for your job. See you.
Thank you very much, Juan, and congratulations on passing your exam. And now you're studying for B2, which is, the way you're speaking, it sounds like you definitely have the B2 level for speaking. Would you agree, Reza?
Yes, if I had to evaluate you, I would say you're perhaps already at a B2 level. So good work, Juan.
We can help you with 2 pronunciation points that came across to me. To come across means to make me realize, or I noticed in your message. The word least, which is L-E-A-S-T, has a long vowel sound, E, like see or me or we. So it's to say the least, to say the least. And another thing we noticed was the pronunciation of purposes, which is stressed on the first syllable. So purposes, purposes, talking at cross purposes.
One other little thing, I'm not sure if it's the quality of the audio. Maybe I didn't hear it right, but I think you said the last podcast have been very useful. But of course, it should be the last podcast has with HAS because it's third person singular. So I'm not sure, but just to clarify, the last podcast has been very useful is what you should say.
And thank you very much, Juan, for sending in your ideas that we're going to use in this episode to speak about 8 more common colloquial expressions. And we're really happy that you're finding these podcasts on colloquial expressions useful because we think they'll be useful for you, but unless you tell us that you're actually learning the expressions and finding them useful, then we really can't be 100% sure. So thank you very much for your feedback.
We are going to talk about your suggestions, Juan, but first of all, we have one more voice message, and it's from Adriana, who comes from Colombia, but who is living in Chile at the moment.
And Adriana also says that she's finding these colloquial expression episodes useful. So here's Adriana.
Hello, Reza and Craig. It's Adriana Ruiz from Chile. I am a Colombian though. I've been living here for almost 10 years and I believe this country has stunning places, delicious food and wonderful people. Hence, I urge you to come over here and have an unforgettable holiday. Besides, you can test your Spanish level, considering Chilean people use a lot of colloquial expressions and they speak very fast. Take it from me. In fact, it was tough for me at the beginning. Well, wrapping up my message, I just want to tell you thanks for your podcast and fun way of teaching. It's really worth listening to, and because of that, I am sharing it with whoever I can, acquaintances, friends, relatives, and coworkers, for sure. By the way, episodes regarding colloquial expressions are incredibly fantastic. You nailed it. I'll be looking forward to hearing my own message on the podcast and to receiving your comments on it. Bye.
Well, thank you very much, Adriana, for your lovely message. We really enjoyed listening to it. Any comments, Reza?
I totally agree with Craig. That was a really nice message and very clear. And we really appreciate your kind words. Thanks, Adriana.
One thing I really enjoyed about the message was listening to you using some lovely colloquial expressions. You used the expression "take it from me," which was an expression on part 1 of the episode Colloquial Expressions back in episode 271. So I love it. It gives me a lot of pleasure when I hear you using an expression that we've taught in the past. That's the reason we do this podcast, is so that you can improve your English. And you also said wrapping up my message, which is a lovely colloquial expression. To wrap up something, that's WRAPPING. Wrapping up my message means finishing my message. So at the end of my message, to wrap something up is to finish it. Did you hear any more colloquial expressions?
Well, I heard a really nice use of the adjective stunning. You spoke about the stunning places in Chile. That's STUNNING. If something is stunning, it stuns you. That means it's so amazing that you're not quite sure how to react. You can't do or say anything. So there must be some very beautiful places in Chile if you find them stunning.
One other expression I liked was "you nailed it." You nailed it, which means you did it very well. If you nail something, NAIL, you do it very well. Perhaps in Spanish you might say something like "has acertado," something like that. You've nailed it with that episode. There's one small pronunciation thing I think you can improve, Adriana, at the beginning of your message. You said something which sounded like argue, but I think what you meant was I urge you, I encourage you. Urge is spelt U-R-G-E, and the J sound at the end is similar pronunciation of judge or June or January or July. So urge. I urge you to do it.
And thanks very much, Adriana, for recommending us to as many people as you can. We really appreciate it.
So going back to Juan's suggestions and his 8 expressions, his 8 colloquial expressions, the first one on the list is to say the least. To say the least. And we use this as an understatement when we're implying that the reality is more extreme or usually worse. Imagine you go to the theatre and the performance of the actor was not very good. It was bad. It was really terrible. It was appalling. You could say, well, his performance was disappointing, to say the least, which means it was worse than disappointing. Can you think of another example?
Imagine you went to a hotel and you got into the room and you realized there was no running water. The floors were dirty. There were cockroaches. You might say, well, our stay in the hotel wasn't great. The accommodation was basic, to say the least. I mean, no running water. That's more than basic, isn't it? So it was basic, to say the least.
I went on a job interview and they offered me a low salary, to say the least, which means the salary was so low it was insulting. They offered me a low salary, to say the least.
So notice that this expression, to say the least, it's always for negative things. It always has a negative connotation.
The next expression is to make small talk. Now, we've spoken about small talk in the past on this podcast. You often make small talk when you're going up and down in the lift, in the elevator with your neighbour. Sometimes the situation could be a little bit uncomfortable. You don't know what to say, so you speak about the weather. Or you speak about the problems with the building. So you speak about things that are not very important, but they pass the time. They're easy to speak about. Other examples, you could speak about sport, for example, like football. You could compliment someone on something they're wearing. So small talk is very light and inconsequential conversation.
A very interesting expression which Juan mentioned was a real talking to, or sometimes a good talking to. It means a severe talk, a serious talk with someone who has done something wrong. I'll give you an example. Reza gave his student a good talking to about doing her homework on time.
I bet you did.
Because she never does her homework on time. So after 8 or 9 occasions, I said, okay, I'm going to give her a good talking to. I really have to be serious and severe now and be hard with her.
Can you remember the last time you gave a student a good talking to? Or the last time you needed to give a student a good talking to?
It was actually a long time ago.
Yeah.
Most students are very responsible, don't you think?
I think, yeah, I agree. But has anybody given you a good talking to recently?
No. When I was younger and even more foolish than I am now, yes, and I probably deserved it. But as you get on in life a bit, you become a bit more sensible, don't you think? No comment.
I'd better not say too much, but there have been some times when I've received a good talking to by people close to me.
By people close to you.
Yeah.
Yes. Particularly partners, wives, people like that. Yes, that's the one exception, isn't it? Yes.
From time to time, I do get a good talking to.
About things like where you leave the toilet roll, how you put the top back on the toothpaste, that type of thing.
That type of thing, yeah. Yeah, that type of thing. Our next expression is to get to the point or come to the point. Now, the point is the purpose of what somebody is saying. And if you tell someone to get to the point or come to the point, you want them to stop talking about unimportant details and say what is most important. So you might say to someone, come on, we haven't got all day. Please get to the point. What are you trying to say? Get to the point.
Yeah, leave out the unimportant details.
Focus on the conversation.
Another one that Juan mentioned, which is really interesting, is to make head or tail of something. It's usually used in a negative, so it'll be not to make head or tail of something. So, for example, I couldn't make head or tail of this new piece of software. I don't know how it works. I couldn't make head or tail of it. I don't know what it's for. I don't know how to install it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it, really. I know nothing about it. I couldn't make head or tail of it.
Would you say couldn't make head or tail of it, or head nor tail of it?
I've heard both. You can say or you can say nor with an N, right? Which one do you prefer?
I couldn't make head nor tail of it. I think I possibly might say nor tail of it, yeah. But I don't think it matters.
It doesn't matter. They're both correct, listeners, so don't worry, whichever you prefer. Perhaps nor sounds slightly more old-fashioned to some people, but it's still used today as well.
Reza, do you think people can make head or tail out of what we say most of the time?
Hopefully some of the time. Some people must, because, look at Juan. He's progressing. He's doing well, and he listens to the podcast, so they must be able to make head or tail of something, right?
Let's hope so. One time when you might not be able to make head nor tail of what we're saying is when Reza and I are talking shop. S-H-O-P. If people talk shop, they talk about their job. And when English teachers get together, they often talk about TEFL. TEFL is teaching English as a foreign language, T-E-F-L. Sometimes it's called EFL or ESL, but there are certain words and expressions that teachers use when they talk shop that are very specific to their profession, and that's called jargon. A software designer has jargon, a doctor has jargon, a plumber has jargon. Every profession has particular words that they use inside their profession, their jargon. So sometimes when we're speaking, Reza and I are speaking in company and there may be someone there who's not an English teacher, one of us might say, I'm really sorry that we're talking shop. Or, come on, Reza, let's stop talking shop because maybe it gets a bit boring.
This expression, which we mentioned earlier to improve Juan's pronunciation of the word purposes, he said, talking at cross purposes, so you stress the first syllable, as we pointed out earlier. That means basically to misunderstand, to talk about different things, but you don't realize you're talking about different things. Another way of saying it is that you are not on the same page. I could say, we didn't understand each other. We weren't on the same page. We were talking at cross purposes. For example, something which really did happen to me with a friend, when she said the food in a restaurant was really hot, I thought she meant the temperature. So I waited for it to cool so it wasn't so hot. I didn't want to burn my mouth. But she meant it was spicy hot. So in English we can say hot for de calor, caliente, but it can also mean picante, and that's what she meant, with loads of chilies. So we were talking at cross purposes. She was saying, be careful, there's a lot of chilies in there. But I thought she was saying, be careful, it's really hot. So I waited for it to cool down. And then when I ate it, it was really cold. And I wasn't very happy because we were talking at cross purposes. We confused picante with caliente, which are both hot in English.
I'm going to talk shop for a minute or two because I know there are some English teachers who listen to this podcast, and I don't know if you've ever played a game with your students, Reza, called Talking at Cross Purposes. Now you put the students in pairs, so two students together, and you write on small pieces of paper a topic. It could be, for example, tennis on one piece of paper and cars on another piece of paper. and you give a piece of paper to a student and tell them to have a conversation about the topic on their card or on their paper. So one student is speaking about tennis, another student is speaking about cars, and they don't know what their subject is, the subject of the other student is, and they're talking at cross purposes, and the conversation is completely illogical and quite funny. You could have one student talking about soup and another student talking about fireworks, or one student talking about skyscrapers and another student talking about tissues. And the conversations are quite funny, and the idea of the game is that you listen carefully and try to guess what the topic of your partner is. But during the conversation, the two people are talking at cross purposes because there's no connection with the two subjects. Have you played that?
I didn't call it talking at cross purposes, but yeah, I have done that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's good.
It's quite funny. It's good fun.
And quite often that very same technique is used in comedy sketches, isn't it?
Yes.
They're talking at cross purposes. And not always, but very often, one person thinks they're talking about sex. So you can get a lot of innuendo out of it. But the other person's talking about, for example, fishing or something like that. So they're talking about how long their line is ago, the fishing rod. Mine's really long, and the other one's convinced they're talking about sex. Like, oh, really? Well, you didn't need to tell me that type of thing. Really obvious kind of innuendo. It's very common to use talking at cross purposes as a way of making comedy.
Our final colloquial expression is what it boils down to is, and it's using the verb to boil, B-O-I-L. You boil water when you want to make tea or coffee, and when you boil something down, you reduce it. If you enjoy cooking, for example, and you have a nice stock to make a paella, the stock is the liquid that you cook the rice in, you need to boil it down to make it concentrated. And we can use this in an idiomatic way to speak about reducing or simplifying a topic to the basic, essential, fundamental thing. Can you think of an example?
For example, people often talk about why a business is doing well or not doing well. They could do this, they could do that, they could do the other. But most things in the world of business, anyway, they boil down to money, don't they?
Yeah.
That's what business is about. So if you're making money, the business is going well. It doesn't really matter what anybody says, it's doing well. And if you're not making money, no matter how good you think it is, it's clearly not doing well. So most things in business and in life, actually, perhaps, they do boil down to money. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, most things come down to or boil down to money. There are similar expressions. You could say at the end of the day, or all in all, or the bottom line is, or you could say what it boils down to is. So what have you learned on this episode? Well, what it boils down to is we hope you've learned 8 new expressions that will help improve your colloquial English. And now it's your turn to practice English. We would love to hear from you. Reza, how can people send us a voice message?
If you want to record your voice, which is our preferred method because we like to hear you practice speaking, send it to speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast, and there you'll see how you can record your voice with a maximum of up to 90 seconds.
And if you can't make head nor tail of the application for the voice messages, why don't you just send us an email? If you don't agree with something we've said, you can give us a good talking to in an email. You can reach me, Craig, C-R-A-I-G, @inglespodcast.com, or you can give Reza a good talking to at his email address, belfastreza, R-E-Z-A, @gmail.com.
And sorry to talk shop, but I want to talk really about a shop.
The Mansion Inglés shop.
Exactly. If you go to store, that's store.mansioningles.net, there you will see the online shop where you can get your hands on many interesting learning products which can help you further improve your English.
But before we say goodbye to you this week, we'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And what it boils down to is you join our Patreon program for as little as $120 per month, including VAT, and you get instant access to recent transcriptions. That's what it boils down to. You can do that by going to Patreon, patreon.com/Ingles podcast.
We'd love to say thank you to every individual sponsor on Patreon. There are quite a lot, but we don't have time. So what we generally do, you'll know if you're a regular listener, is we thank the most recent people who have joined the scheme. They are Mick Olm, Juan David Guerrero, Uziv, Israel Arguello, André Coman, John, Gloria Rodas, Juancho Cuyas, Adrian Caraballo, and last but not least, Maria. Thank you very much for donating more than the minimum. But thank you to all of you.
Yes, thank you very, very much for your support. Now, on next week's episode, I think you'll agree that learning a language is quite difficult to say the least. However, how long does it take to learn a language? We'll be talking about that question next week that's come from a listener, and also answering your feedback and your comments. Until next time, thank you for listening this week. Have a fantastic week. It's goodbye from Reza.
And it's bye-bye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.